Flight attendant harassed black man. Didn't expect he was the airport director. Jason stood in the airport lounge, casually observing the bustle of travelers moving in and out, the air thick with the noise of rolling suitcases and murmured conversations. He was dressed simply, dark jeans and a button-up shirt, a blend of comfort and understated professionalism, but in his posture, there was an unmistakable authority. As the airport director, Jason had seen it all, from smooth operations to moments of chaos. Today, however, was supposed to be just another quiet moment between meetings. But then, as he sat back in his chair, his calm was shattered by the sound of heels clicking sharply against the floor. A flight attendant, her uniform pristine and her demeanor stern, walked up to him. Her gaze scanned him for a moment before she spoke, her voice dripping with condescension. "You don't belong here," she said, not even offering him the courtesy of a greeting. Jason looked up, confused for a second before the realization hit him. She didn't recognize him. She assumed he was just another traveler. He could feel his pulse quicken, his patience wearing thin. "I'm waiting for my meeting," he replied, his voice steady, offering her the simplest of explanations. The woman's expression remained unyielding. She eyed him with clear suspicion, the casual glance becoming a judgment. Without so much as a blink, she commanded, "You need to leave this area. This is a staff lounge." Jason's brows furrowed in disbelief. He stood up, feeling the weight of the situation bear down on him. "I'm not going anywhere." The tension in the room thickened, and Jason's heart raced. How could this be happening? Seconds later, her fingers brushed the radio clipped to her uniform, and the words that followed made it clear this was no ordinary misunderstanding. The words security and unauthorized cut through the air, and Jason realized this wasn't just about a misplaced badge. He was being challenged in a way that cut deeper than any normal encounter. As the room around him began to feel smaller, Jason stood his ground, refusing to back down. But the words from the flight attendant hung in the air, and before he could even catch his breath, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed in the hallway. Would this moment escalate beyond control? If you're shocked by what happened next, make sure to hit that subscribe button, and let us know where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. Before Jason could fully process the situation, the door swung open. Jennifer's gaze lingered for a moment longer than necessary, the weight of her judgment pressing down on Jason. "You don't belong here," she repeated, her tone laced with disbelief, as if she had just uncovered something hidden beneath his calm demeanor. "This is a staff-only area." Jason's brows furrowed, trying to hold back the frustration rising within him. The flight attendant's assumption hit him like a sudden wave. He had been here countless times before, part of the fabric of the airport's operations, overseeing the smooth running of one of the busiest terminals in the country. Yet, here he was, being treated as though he were out of place, an outsider. "I'm the airport director," Jason said, his voice steady, but there was a palpable edge beneath the calmness. He motioned to the staff badge clipped to his shirt, the same one he wore every day. "I'm waiting for my meeting, just like anyone else here." But Jennifer's dismissive expression didn't waver. She took a slow step back, her eyes scanning him from head to toe, assessing him like a puzzle that couldn't quite be solved. Her lips curled into a tight smile, one that reeked of condescension. "Yeah, sure," she muttered, her voice dropping in volume, but not in tone. "Nice try. But this area is for actual staff members, not whatever you are." Jason's stomach turned. He could feel the sting of her words, sharp and unrelenting, though he wasn't about to let her see how deeply they cut. The way she said it, "whatever you are," felt like a dismissal not just of him, but of everything he had worked for, everything he had accomplished. The assumption in her words was blatant, a stark reminder of the biases some people carried without a second thought. Jason straightened, taking a deep breath. His mind raced through the countless moments in his career where he had proven himself, where he had stood before the board and management, leading critical operations. His accomplishments were not in question, but in that moment, standing in the lounge, his position, his worth, seemed irrelevant to Jennifer. He was simply another black man, one who didn't belong in her eyes. "I'm not going anywhere," Jason said firmly, his eyes locking onto hers with the calm confidence he had learned to master over the years. Jennifer, however, wasn't listening. She didn't care about the credentials he offered, the badge he wore, or the years he had spent proving himself in this very airport. The prejudice in her eyes was enough to override any logic. Jason's skin color, his presence in a space that didn't align with her perception of who belonged, was all that mattered to her in that moment. The seconds stretched between them, and Jason could feel the tension building. The weight of the situation pressed on his chest. He had dealt with racism before, but this was different. This wasn't just about prejudice from strangers on the street. This was someone in a position of power, someone who was supposed to be professional, making snap judgments based on nothing more than the color of his skin. His patience was beginning to fray. He took a slow, steadying breath, his mind focusing on the words he needed to say to diffuse this escalating tension. "I don't know what you think is happening here, but I'm telling you the truth. Please, just ask around if you're unsure." But Jennifer wasn't interested in asking anyone. Instead, her hand shot out to her radio, the cold metal of the device clicking sharply as she pressed the button. "Security, we have an unauthorized individual in the lounge," Jennifer said with a practiced air of authority, as if she were calling in a code red. "Get someone up here now." Jason's chest tightened. He had been accused of many things in his life. Bad decisions, miscalculations, even failures. But never had he been reduced to something so simple, so unfair, as being an unauthorized individual. He stood there, frozen, as the weight of the situation sunk in. The words she spoke were like a knife, cutting away the respect he had earned and replacing it with suspicion. "I don't have time for this," Jennifer muttered, her eyes never leaving Jason's face, the disdain never leaving her voice. "You can explain yourself to security." Jason opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. His throat tightened as he realized there was no reasoning with her, no bridge to cross. He could feel the humiliation creeping up on him, something he had worked so hard to avoid in his career, especially in this place where he had fought to be seen as more than just a statistic. But here, in this lounge, none of that mattered. He glanced around the room, hoping someone would intervene, hoping someone would back him up. But the staff, the pilots, the other airport employees, no one met his eyes. They all pretended to be busy with their own tasks, their gaze deliberately avoiding his. The door to the lounge creaked open, and Jason heard the echoing footsteps of security approaching. His heart sank. This wasn't how this day was supposed to unfold. He had only wanted to sit, wait, and talk business. Instead, his mere presence had turned into a threat in Jennifer's eyes. Just before the security officers entered the room, Jason felt his stomach twist, his anger rising like an uncontrollable force. He was about to be escorted out, not because he had done anything wrong, but because someone had decided that he didn't belong. And that was when it hit him. Would this moment of injustice define him, or would he finally take a stand? As the security officers entered, Jason knew this was about to escalate in a way that no one could have anticipated. The sound of footsteps grew louder as the security officers approached, their heavy boots echoing against the polished floor of the lounge. Jason's heart beat faster, the weight of the situation crushing him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He could hear the murmurs from the staff outside the lounge, the whispers of doubt and curiosity that had been sparked by Jennifer's call to security. It was as if the very air had thickened with judgment, each passing second adding to the surreal weight of what was happening. As the door swung open, two security officers entered. One was tall, with short-cropped hair and a stern face that seemed to carry the weight of years spent in authority. The other was shorter, stockier, with a more approachable demeanor. But the coldness in his eyes told Jason all he needed to know. They had been called in for him, and they were here to remove him. Not for any legitimate reason, but because Jennifer had decided he didn't belong. Jason took a step forward, his hand reaching for his badge. "I'm Jason Miller, the airport director," he said, trying to keep his voice calm, despite the frustration bubbling within him. "I've been here for years. You can verify my identity with HR or management. I'm not the person you think I am." The taller officer barely glanced at the badge before waving it off dismissively. "We've been told you don't belong here. This area is for staff only. You'll have to leave." Jason's blood ran cold, his stomach twisted in disbelief. How could this be happening? He had spent years working in this very airport, making sure operations ran smoothly, ensuring safety protocols were followed, and dealing with everything from minor issues to major crises. And now, because of a single assumption based on his appearance, he was being treated like a criminal. "Please, I'm telling you, I belong here," Jason continued, his voice steady but filled with a deep frustration that he could no longer contain. "This is my office. I'm the director. You can call anyone in the administration to verify what I'm saying." The shorter officer crossed his arms, his face unreadable. "We're just following protocol. If you want to argue, we can do that outside, but we need you to leave." Jason opened his mouth to protest, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. This was absurd. It wasn't just about being asked to leave. It was about being treated as though his identity, his position, didn't matter. He was being dehumanized, reduced to a stereotype, simply because of the color of his skin. It didn't matter that he was in charge of the very systems that kept this airport running. To Jennifer, to the security officers, he was just another black man, someone who didn't belong. He glanced around the lounge, hoping for someone to step in, someone to see the injustice of the situation and speak up. But the room was silent. No one moved. No one intervened. He was alone. "I'm not leaving," Jason finally said, his voice sharp. "I've done nothing wrong." The taller officer took a step toward him, his expression hardening. "You don't have a choice. Either you leave willingly or we'll have to escort you out." Jason's fists clenched at his sides, but he refused to let the anger boil over. This wasn't about him losing control. This was about something much deeper, something far more insidious than a simple misunderstanding. He took another deep breath, steadying himself. "This is wrong. You're making a mistake." But his words fell on deaf ears. The shorter officer took another step forward, and the taller one moved to block his exit, both of them standing between Jason and the door. "This is getting out of hand," Jason muttered, his frustration growing. He had never felt so helpless in his life. How could something so simple turn into something so humiliating, so painful? He had done everything right. He had earned his position, his respect, his place in this airport. But all of that was irrelevant now. Now he was just a black man who didn't fit the mold of who people thought should be in this space. Without warning, the shorter officer placed a hand on Jason's shoulder, urging him toward the door. "It's time to go." Jason flinched at the touch, the force of the officer's hand pulling him from his thoughts. He tried to remain calm, but the feeling of being physically restrained, of being moved against his will, was too much. His heart raced as he fought the impulse to lash out, but he held himself in check. This wasn't the time. "I'm not going anywhere," Jason said again, his voice louder now, but his words seemed to dissolve in the sterile air of the lounge. The officers exchanged a glance, then stepped closer. They didn't see a man of authority. They saw a black man, and that was enough for them to disregard his word, his badge, his identity. The taller officer's hand rested on Jason's arm now, a forceful gesture meant to remove him. "You're not in charge here," the officer said coldly. "Come with us, or we'll have to make this harder for you." Jason's chest tightened. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding anymore. This wasn't just a case of being asked to leave. He was being escorted out under suspicion, treated like a criminal. He could feel the tension building, his anger pushing him to the brink of eruption. How had it come to this? How had something as simple as waiting for a meeting turned into an ordeal that questioned his very worth? Jason took one last look at the room, the staff, the pilots, the people who had known him, worked with him, and had never once doubted his authority. Yet now, in the eyes of those around him, he was just another man to be escorted out under suspicion. And with that thought, Jason took the first step toward the door, his frustration growing, his mind racing with the bitter truth. It wasn't about him being in the wrong place. It was about the skin he wore. As he stepped toward the exit, Jason realized that this was more than just about a misunderstanding. This moment would haunt him long after the doors closed behind him. As Jason was escorted out of the lounge, he couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation that clung to him. The security officers, oblivious to his true identity, seemed completely detached from the gravity of the situation. Their hands on his shoulders felt heavy, as if they were marking him as a threat when all he had done was show up for a routine meeting. His mind raced with disbelief, but he kept his composure, focusing on one thing: getting this mess straightened out. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling just enough for it to catch his attention. He dialed the number of his supervisor, Mr. Roberts, hoping that someone, anyone, would realize the mistake. The ringing in his ears seemed to stretch on forever, the tension in the air growing thicker with each passing second. His stomach twisted into knots as the seconds turned into an agonizing eternity. Finally, the call connected. "Mr. Roberts?" Jason said, his voice steady but filled with frustration. "It's Jason Miller. I need your help." There was a brief silence on the other end before his supervisor's voice came through, muffled at first, but growing clearer. "Jason, what's going on? You should be in the meeting by now." "I've been harassed," Jason replied, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I'm being escorted out by security. Apparently, they think I'm some unauthorized person in the staff lounge." "What? Wait, harassed? By who?" Roberts asked, the shock evident in his tone. "By the flight attendants," Jason explained, taking a deep breath. "A flight attendant, Jennifer, assumed I didn't belong there because of how I look. She called security on me, said I was using a fake ID, and now they're forcing me out." Maya, as she relayed Jason's call, could almost feel the shock radiating from the words. The disbelief in his voice was palpable. Here was a man in charge, a man who had worked his way to the top, being reduced to an object of suspicion. It wasn't just the mistake, it was the sheer audacity of it, the assumption that someone like him, a black man in a position of power, couldn't possibly belong in the staff lounge. It was a stark reminder of the deep-seated prejudice that many people, like Jennifer, carried so easily with them. Maya paused for a moment, reflecting on how quickly things had escalated. Jason's calm demeanor, his steady resolve, stood in contrast to the situation surrounding him. He wasn't the kind of man who would panic or lash out. But inside, the sting of injustice must have been unbearable, knowing that his identity was being erased in front of him simply because of the way others perceived him. On the phone, Jason's voice remained calm as he continued. "I'm the airport director, Mr. Roberts, you know me. I've been working here for years. This is insane." The air around Jason seemed to thicken with the weight of the words he had just spoken. His calmness in the face of such a degrading situation was nothing short of remarkable. He wasn't just a black man being wrongly accused. He was a professional, a man who had built his career, earned his position. Yet, in this moment, none of that seemed to matter. It didn't matter that he ran the airport's operations with efficiency, that his name was on countless documents and reports. To Jennifer, to the security officers, and now, even to some of the onlookers in the lounge, Jason was just another person who didn't belong. Mr. Roberts, still processing the shock of what he was hearing, responded with urgency. "This has to be a misunderstanding. Let me make a few calls. Stay where you are. I'll get this sorted out." Jason, now feeling the full weight of his humiliation, leaned against the wall, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of solidarity, any face that might show a flicker of recognition. But no one stepped forward. He felt completely isolated, his years of hard work and dedication seemingly forgotten in an instant. The call ended, and Jason, still standing in the hallway, tried to steady his breathing. He knew Mr. Roberts would take action, but the damage had already been done. The seeds of doubt had been planted in the minds of the airport staff. It didn't matter how this would resolve. It would always linger, the stain of suspicion forever marking the day. Maya's voice echoed in the background as she recounted the growing disbelief in Jason's supervisor's voice. The airport director, a man who was in charge of overseeing operations, who had been instrumental in ensuring everything ran smoothly, was now being treated like a threat. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a failure of the system, a reflection of the biases that still pervaded spaces meant to be open, inclusive, and professional. Within minutes, Mr. Roberts had called Jennifer and the other flight attendants. Maya could sense the shift in the conversation, the growing realization of the mistake they had made. Jason's position was clear now, but the implications of the misunderstanding would take much longer to resolve. Jennifer's initial actions had been based solely on her assumptions, and now she was going to have to face the consequences of her hasty judgment. As the conversation between Mr. Roberts and the flight attendants unfolded, Jason stood there, waiting for someone to come and confirm what he had known all along, that he belonged. But would that confirmation be enough to undo the damage already done? The minutes seemed to stretch endlessly as Jason waited in the hallway, the tension still hanging in the air like a cloud that wouldn't dissipate. His heart raced, his mind still reeling from the humiliation he had just experienced. Despite the calm exterior he had shown, the reality of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. He was still, in that moment, a man pushed aside by prejudice, his identity dismissed without question. And yet, in the midst of the quiet, there was something else stirring within him, a desire for justice, a burning need for this to be more than just a misunderstanding. He couldn't let this moment pass without making sure it wasn't swept under the rug, dismissed as just another isolated incident. No, this had to be a turning point, a moment when something changed for the better. Within moments, Jason's phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Mr. Roberts calling back. Jason answered quickly, his frustration still simmering beneath the surface. "Jason, I'm so sorry," Mr. Roberts' voice came through, laced with urgency and genuine remorse. "I've already contacted HR, and we're taking immediate action. Jennifer and the security team are being called into a meeting right now to address this. I'm going to be speaking to the entire staff about what happened, but I want to personally apologize to you for the mistake." This was completely unacceptable. Jason felt a slight relief hearing the words, but it was far from enough. An apology wasn't going to erase the damage done, not just to his reputation, but to his sense of dignity. He had done nothing wrong, but in the eyes of those who had witnessed this ordeal, it seemed like there was a shadow of doubt cast over him now. He wasn't sure how many people would remember the apology or whether they would remember the way he had been treated. "I appreciate the apology, Mr. Roberts," Jason replied, trying to keep his voice level. "But I need more than that. This isn't just about me. It's about the way others will treat people like me, every day. This has to be addressed at a deeper level. It can't just be a one-off situation." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Mr. Roberts responded. "You're absolutely right. We're going to implement racial sensitivity training for everyone, starting with Jennifer and the security staff. We're going to do better, Jason. I promise you that." Jason nodded, though he knew the words were easy to say. What mattered was action, and he would be watching closely to ensure it followed through. As the conversation ended, Jason was led back toward the lounge. The staff had already begun to gather, their eyes cautious, knowing what was coming. When he entered, he was met with the somber faces of the flight attendants, security officers, and even a few of his colleagues. It was clear that they hadn't expected this turn of events. Jennifer stood off to one side, her arms crossed defensively, but there was a slight wariness in her posture, a quiet understanding that she was about to face the consequences of her actions. Mr. Roberts, standing at the front of the room, turned to Jason, his expression full of sincerity. "Jason," he said, his voice carrying through the room, "I want to publicly apologize for what happened. No one should have treated you the way you were treated today, and I'm deeply sorry for the distress it caused you. You've worked here for years, and your contributions are invaluable. This should never have happened." Jason nodded slowly, accepting the apology but not letting it disarm him completely. "Thank you, Mr. Roberts," he said, his voice firm. "But what matters now is that we learn from this, and that we ensure it doesn't happen again. This isn't just about one person or one situation, it's about a deeper issue that needs to be addressed." Jennifer stepped forward, her face reddened with both guilt and defiance. "I'm sorry," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't know. I didn't think." Jason met her gaze, his eyes cold but composed. "I'm sure you didn't, but that's the problem, isn't it? You didn't think, you didn't ask, you just assumed, and that assumption almost cost me my dignity. And worse, it almost sent the message to others that this kind of treatment is okay." Jennifer looked down, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't have a response, and Jason didn't expect one. He wasn't looking for her apology. He was looking for acknowledgement and a commitment to change. The room was quiet for a moment as Jason's words sank in, the gravity of the situation becoming clearer to everyone present. This wasn't just about a mistake. It was about the subtle, pervasive biases that fueled decisions like Jennifer's. It wasn't enough to simply apologize. It was about dismantling the framework that allowed such prejudice to exist in the first place. Jason turned to leave, his mind already focused on what needed to happen next. But before he could walk out of the room, Mr. Roberts stopped him. "I want to meet with you later, Jason. We need to discuss how we move forward from here. This is just the beginning." Jason paused and then nodded. "I'll be there. But make sure this isn't just talk. We need real change." As Jason left the meeting, his mind was already racing with the steps that would need to be taken to ensure this wasn't just a fleeting moment of accountability. Would the system truly change, or would it be business as usual? Jason had no intention of waiting for someone else to make that decision. The real work was just beginning. The door to the small private office clicked shut behind Jason as he stepped inside. The room was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that thickened the air, making every movement feel amplified. He took a slow breath, trying to steady the storm of emotions swirling inside him. The events of the day had taken everything out of him, humiliation, frustration, confusion, but he had managed to hold it together, just barely. Now, face to face with Jennifer, he knew this confrontation would be the final test of his resolve. Jennifer was already sitting at the desk, her back straight, her eyes trained on the floor as if avoiding his gaze. The tension in the room was palpable. She had no words at first, nothing to say that could undo what had just happened. Jason could see it in her posture, the way her shoulders were tense, the way her hands fidgeted in her lap. She was nervous, but more than that, she was ashamed. Jason stood in front of her, his own gaze unwavering. He felt no need to sugarcoat what needed to be said. He wasn't here to make her feel better. He was here to make her understand the gravity of her actions. He had no patience left for pleasantries or half-hearted apologies. "So," Jason began, his voice steady but firm, "what happened today? What made you think it was okay to treat me like that?" Jennifer's eyes flickered up to meet his for a brief moment before quickly dropping again, as if the weight of his question was too much to bear. I didn't mean to," she stammered, but her words trailed off, failing to justify the unjustifiable. "You didn't mean to?" Jason's tone sharpened. "You didn't mean to assume that I didn't belong just because I'm black? That's what you're telling me? That's your excuse?" The silence hung in the air like a suffocating fog. Jennifer's hands clenched tightly together, and Jason could see the guilt and discomfort radiating from her. But it wasn't enough. Not for him. "You didn't even think to ask," Jason continued, his voice gaining strength. "You didn't think to ask who I was, what I was doing there. You just assumed. And that assumption was based solely on my appearance. Because of my skin color, you decided that I was an outsider, that I didn't belong." Jennifer's face flushed with shame, and she lowered her head further, not able to meet his eyes. Jason could see the shift in her demeanor, the guilt that was beginning to overtake her. But it wasn't enough. Apologies and tears wouldn't undo the damage. This wasn't about her discomfort, it was about the harm she had caused. "I've worked at this airport for years," Jason continued, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. "I've earned every inch of respect I've received here. But today, for no reason other than the color of my skin, I was treated like a criminal. You didn't see me as the airport director. You saw me as a threat." Jennifer's hands trembled in her lap, and she finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with guilt and regret. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke. "I didn't realize. I didn't think." Jason shook his head, cutting her off. "That's the problem. You didn't think. You didn't take a second to question your own assumptions. You didn't stop to consider that maybe, just maybe, I was there for the same reasons you are, because I belong here." The silence in the room deepened, suffocating the space between them. Jason could feel the weight of her regret, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to erase the damage done, to erase the feeling of being unseen, unheard, just because of the way he looked. He wasn't here to make Jennifer feel better. He wasn't here to let her off the hook. He was here to ensure that this wouldn't happen again. Not just to him, but to anyone else who found themselves in his position. "You made a mistake, Jennifer," Jason said, his voice calm but resolute. "But it's not just about you apologizing to me. It's about the systems that allow this kind of thinking to exist. The systems that let people like you make assumptions and act on them. What happened today wasn't just a one-time incident. It's part of a much larger problem, one that's been allowed to persist for far too long." Jennifer's eyes welled up with tears, and for the first time, Jason saw the full weight of what her actions had caused. She realized that her mistake wasn't just a personal one. It was a reflection of the deeper, more pervasive prejudices that lay beneath the surface of everyday interactions. She had failed to see Jason as a person, as someone who had earned his place. Instead, she had seen him as someone to be questioned, dismissed, and marginalized, and that hurt far more than any apology could fix. Jason's gaze softened slightly, but his resolve remained unshaken. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Jennifer," he said, his voice steady. "What I'm asking for is change, real change. I want you and everyone else in this airport to understand that these assumptions have real consequences. We need to do better. We need racial sensitivity training for all staff from the top down. I don't want this to happen again. Not to me, not to anyone." Jennifer nodded slowly, her eyes still filled with regret. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." Jason stood, his eyes still locked on her, searching for any sign that she truly understood the weight of his words. He wasn't going to let this moment slip away. It couldn't just be about making her feel better. It had to be about accountability and action. As Jason turned to leave, he couldn't help but wonder, would the airport truly follow through on the changes he was demanding? Or would this moment fade into the background, just another story of injustice that was never fully addressed? The answer would depend on what happened next. The days that followed Jason's confrontation felt like a slow-burning shift, a change that began to ripple through the airport in ways that no one had anticipated. At first, it seemed like just another incident that would be swept under the rug, quickly forgotten as time marched on. But Jason's resolve had planted a seed, one that would grow into something much more powerful than anyone could have predicted. Maya observed the subtle transformations as they began to unfold. The first sign was Jennifer's reaction after the meeting with Jason. Initially, she seemed distant, almost resigned. But slowly, as the days passed, she began to engage more openly with the people around her. She wasn't the same flight attendant who had passed judgment so quickly. Something had shifted in her, a quiet understanding of the weight of her actions and a genuine desire to learn and change. It was Jason's call for systemic change that set the wheels of transformation in motion. The airport, recognizing the magnitude of the situation, began implementing racial sensitivity training for all employees. Jennifer was asked to attend the first session, along with several other staff members who had been involved in the incident, including the security officers. The training, however, wasn't just about making apologies. It was about confronting uncomfortable truths and examining the biases that influenced everyday interactions. Maya watched as the training unfolded, her thoughts heavy with reflection. She had seen these small acts of prejudice before, incidents that went unnoticed by those in power. It was easy to brush off a comment, to laugh along with a joke, to overlook a glance that lingered too long. But those small, seemingly insignificant moments added up over time, layering on the scars of those who were targeted. It was these moments, these quiet acts of exclusion and suspicion, that created a culture of discrimination that was difficult to uproot. Jason had been subjected to one such moment, but his response had sparked something bigger. It wasn't just his fight anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or stereotyped. And as the airport employees sat through the training, Maya could see the discomfort on their faces. It wasn't easy to confront one's own biases, to acknowledge that they had been complicit in the systems of inequality that had quietly thrived around them. But this was the first step toward understanding, toward real change. Jennifer, for her part, seemed to take the training seriously. Maya noticed her approach to the other staff members shifting. She was more open, more receptive to feedback. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly didn't erase the damage of that single moment in the lounge, but it was a start. Jennifer's participation in the training was a small victory, but one that symbolized the beginning of a larger cultural shift that Jason had called for. The more people who recognized their own biases, the more likely it was that the workplace would transform into one that was truly inclusive and fair. Maya's thoughts then drifted to the many other small acts of racial prejudice she had witnessed over the years, both in the airport and beyond. She thought about the subtle ways people of color were overlooked in meetings, the dismissive comments that went unchecked, the microaggressions that were brushed off as jokes. Those moments were never addressed in any meaningful way, and as a result, they festered, becoming deeply ingrained in the workplace culture. The damage they caused often went unnoticed, but it was real. It wore people down, making them question their own worth and whether they belonged. Jason's actions had brought those issues to light. His call for change hadn't just been about him. It had been about every person who had ever been made to feel small because of the color of their skin. His story was now part of the conversation, a conversation that had been long overdue. As Jason's influence grew, his story became a talking point among the airport staff. Maya could hear the whispers as she walked through the terminals, the quiet conversations that popped up in break rooms, in hallways, in the corridors of power. People were starting to listen, not just to what Jason had experienced, but to the truth he had shared. The story of his treatment had become a catalyst, a powerful example of how systemic prejudice could manifest in the most unlikely places. And it wasn't just the staff who were taking notice. The leadership team at the airport, which had initially responded with shock and embarrassment, now began to discuss the long-term implications of Jason's experience. They were evaluating policies, looking at how diversity was represented at every level of the airport, from the ground staff to the upper echelons of management. Maya could see the wheels turning, the quiet realization dawning on those who had previously been blind to the everyday realities of discrimination. The real work, though, was just beginning. Jason's fight for fairness had ignited a fire that wasn't going to be easily extinguished. It was clear to Maya that the airport, once a microcosm of the larger world, was on the verge of a profound cultural shift. People were starting to see the ways in which their own actions, however small, could perpetuate a system of inequality. The question now was whether the airport and the people within it were truly ready to embrace the change that was coming. As Maya watched the first signs of change take root, she couldn't help but wonder, would this be enough? Would the lessons learned in those training sessions actually stick, or would they be forgotten once the dust settled? Jason's call for change had set something in motion, but would it lead to lasting transformation? Or would it fade into just another well-meaning but short-lived initiative? The weeks following Jason's confrontation were marked by an unexpected shift in the atmosphere at the airport. What had started as a tense and isolating experience for Jason had quickly become a catalyst for something much larger. Maya watched as the conversations began to change. Staff members, once quiet about issues of race, were now talking openly. The ripple effect of Jason's experience had sparked an awakening in the workplace, and for the first time, the reality of racial prejudice was being discussed at all levels. The chatter in the break rooms, the corridors, even the lounge areas, all seemed to center around the same theme. A growing realization that the airport, despite its professionalism and diverse workforce, had been ignoring a crucial part of its identity. Maya had never seen anything like it. The discussions weren't just about what happened to Jason. They were about how, for too long, racism had silently shaped the culture at the airport. Maya overheard one conversation between two junior staff members as she passed through the terminal. "I always thought I was above it," one of them, a young woman named Clara, said, her voice quiet but filled with sincerity. "Like, I'd never make assumptions about anyone. But after what happened to Jason, I realized I've done it. I've judged people before, just like she did. It's easy, without even thinking about it." Her colleague nodded. "Same here. It's like you don't even realize the little things, how we treat each other. It's so ingrained. You don't realize how deep it runs until something like this happens." Maya stood there for a moment, listening, almost forgetting herself. This was what Jason had hoped for. Real conversations, real self-reflection. People were starting to recognize their own unconscious biases, acknowledging that they had unknowingly contributed to the culture of discrimination. The realization wasn't easy for many. Some were defensive at first, unwilling to accept the truth of their own actions. But slowly, as more conversations unfolded, the general attitude began to change. The moment Jason's story spread beyond the confines of his confrontation, it became clear that the incident wasn't just about one person's mistake. It was about a larger, more pervasive issue that reached far beyond the airport lounge. Maya noticed how even those who were initially silent, the ones who had avoided getting involved in the matter, were beginning to participate in these discussions. It wasn't just about Jason anymore. His story had opened up a window for others to examine their own behaviors. The flight attendants who had remained passive, the security officers who had stood by without question, all began to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that they too might be complicit, even unknowingly, in perpetuating bias. The airport's management team too wasn't immune to the shifting conversations. Maya watched as they came together in meetings, discussing how they could address not just the incident with Jason, but the broader issue of racial equity across all levels of the airport. For years, the airport had been a place of business, an operation focused on efficiency and customer service. But now, it was becoming clear that diversity and inclusion needed to be woven into the fabric of the organization's values, not just as an afterthought, but as a core principle. As Maya observed this transformation, she felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't going to be a quick fix or an overnight transformation, but the wheels of change were turning. Jason had sparked a fire, and now it was up to the airport community to decide whether it would burn out or become something lasting. Jason himself was humble about the shift his actions had initiated. When asked about it by a few colleagues, he would simply shrug and say, "I didn't do this for recognition. I did it because I believe change is possible, but it won't happen without us taking a hard look at ourselves." Maya admired his resolve. He wasn't asking for fame or praise. He was asking for something deeper, something that could affect everyone in the airport, regardless of rank or title. One afternoon, Maya overheard a conversation between two senior managers. "We can't just issue a memo and call it a day," one said. "We need real, tangible policies that address how we deal with bias, how we train our staff, how we encourage people to speak up when they see something wrong." Jason's experience was just the beginning. The other manager agreed. "It's not just about having a diversity program. It's about making sure that we live and breathe those values every day, from the top down." Maya could feel the momentum building. The airport was finally facing its own reflection. No longer could it be a place where people turned a blind eye to the subtle, daily acts of racism. No longer could it be a place where a black man, no matter how high-ranking, was treated as an outsider in his own workplace. With the wheels of change in motion, Maya couldn't help but wonder, would these conversations lead to real change, or would the system find a way to resist it? Would the airport's leadership commit to making real, lasting changes, or would they fall back on old habits? Only time would tell. But Maya was determined to stay vigilant, knowing that this was just the beginning of a much larger journey. Weeks passed, and the impact of Jason's bravery slowly began to echo throughout the airport. What had initially felt like a single, isolated incident had transformed into a much broader conversation. Maya watched as the atmosphere gradually shifted from one of silence and discomfort to a growing recognition that change, though slow, was on the horizon. The leadership at the airport had acted swiftly in implementing the racial sensitivity training that Jason had demanded. It wasn't a one-off seminar, but a long-term commitment to making diversity, inclusion, and racial equity a central part of the workplace culture. The training sessions, which started with the staff members involved in Jason's confrontation, soon expanded to include every employee across all departments, from maintenance crews to administrative staff. Maya had a front-row seat to the changes, and while they were not without challenges, the difference was undeniable. The training wasn't easy for everyone. Some of the staff members who had been indifferent to the issue of race or had never considered their own biases were initially resistant. Maya heard comments in the halls like, "This isn't necessary. I've never treated anyone differently," or "We're just being forced to do this for PR." But with every session, there was a gradual shift in how the staff approached the conversation. Maya observed, especially in the quieter moments, when people started asking questions that had been buried for too long. People were beginning to acknowledge how much they hadn't seen before. They began to realize that while they might not have been outright racists, they had been complicit in maintaining systems that allowed prejudice to thrive. Jason's influence, though he remained a quiet figure in the background, was spreading across departments. Maintenance workers who rarely interacted with the higher-ups began to talk openly about how racial stereotypes had shaped their experiences at work. Administrative assistants spoke candidly about how they had witnessed discriminatory behavior, but never knew how to address it. Maya was particularly struck by a conversation she overheard one afternoon in the break room. One of the younger managers, a woman named Rachel, was speaking with an older colleague who had been with the airport for over 20 years. "You know," Rachel said, her voice hesitant at first but gaining strength, "I never really understood how subtle bias could be. I thought racism was just about big, obvious things, like slurs or outright discrimination. But after the training, I get it now. It's the small things, the comments we let slide, the assumptions we make about who belongs in certain places." Her colleague nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, I've been thinking about that too. I've been in this business a long time, and I can't tell you how many times I've seen people get passed over for promotions, not because of their work, but because of the way they look. I didn't always notice it before, but now I see it. It's everywhere." Maya had overheard many such conversations in the past few weeks, and each one was a small victory. People were acknowledging the problem, talking about it, and taking steps to address it. It was no longer just Jason's battle. It was everyone's fight, and the momentum was building. But Maya knew better than to think this was the end. Change didn't happen overnight, and the airport's journey toward true equality was far from complete. As much as she wanted to believe that this was a turning point, Maya knew that real change would require more than just training sessions and conversations. It would require a sustained effort, a deep commitment to making the airport a place where everyone truly felt they belonged. There were still employees who hadn't fully embraced the training, still moments when prejudice would rear its ugly head. She had no illusion that it would be easy. Jason, too, had remained a steady presence, though he kept a low profile. He wasn't seeking accolades or recognition. His goal was simple: to ensure that the treatment he'd experienced was never repeated. And slowly, through his influence, the airport was becoming a place where that was beginning to happen. One evening, Maya found herself talking to Jason outside the terminal. She had watched him work quietly behind the scenes, attending meetings, speaking with management, pushing for change. But he never sought the spotlight. His role in the airport's transformation was evident, yet he remained humble, always focusing on the larger picture. "You've made a real difference," Maya said to him, her voice filled with quiet admiration. Jason looked at her, a faint smile on his face. "It's not over. Not by a long shot, but every small step counts. We're getting there, one conversation at a time." Maya nodded. She knew he was right. Change, especially the kind that lasts, was a slow process, and the road ahead would be filled with obstacles. But she also knew that Jason had lit a fire that couldn't be easily extinguished. People were talking, thinking, and, most importantly, acting. It was a start. Though things were improving, Maya knew that the struggle for true equality was far from over. Would the momentum continue, or would complacency set in? The journey was only beginning, and the next test would be whether the airport and its people would continue to embrace the change they had so bravely started. As Maya watched Jason stand in front of the airport's leadership team one final time, she couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. When she first saw him escorted out of the lounge, humiliated and falsely accused, she never would have imagined that the events would unfold the way they had. What started as an isolated incident, rooted in ignorance and bias, had turned into a powerful movement for change. But the real victory was not just in the policies and training being implemented. It was in Jason himself and the personal growth he had undergone in the process. Jason had always been a man of integrity, but through this entire ordeal, he had learned to embrace something deeper: his sense of justice. He had learned that standing up for what was right wasn't just about defending yourself, but about challenging the status quo, even when it meant facing discomfort, ridicule, or fear. Maya had seen the subtle change in him over the weeks. His posture had shifted, his confidence grew, but so did his sense of responsibility. Jason didn't see himself as a hero or a martyr. He saw himself as someone who had to act because no one else was. He told her once, after the initial confrontation, that he wasn't fighting for his own dignity. "I have nothing to prove," he said, "but I can't ignore what's happening. If I stay silent, I'm letting this system keep hurting people like me, and worse, I'm letting others suffer without a chance to be heard." Through every meeting, every conversation, every piece of policy he helped shape, Jason remained grounded in this simple truth. Justice was not just about fixing what was broken for him. It was about making sure that others wouldn't have to endure the same treatment. He didn't want to just be a figurehead for change. He wanted to be a part of something real, something that would outlast him. Maya had seen him speak to employees from every department, from the janitors who cleaned the floors to the managers who controlled the budgets. He never preached, never lectured. Instead, He quietly asked them to reflect on their own biases, to challenge their own assumptions. His influence wasn't in the forcefulness of his words, it was in the way he lived his truth. He had turned his own painful experience into a lesson for everyone around him, not by demanding change, but by showing others that it was possible. But as Maya observed Jason now, standing tall in front of the airport's leadership team, she realized that he had learned something even more profound. It wasn't just about the change that had been made, it was about how he had handled it. Jason had the rare ability to take injustice head-on without becoming bitter or vindictive. His decision to confront Jennifer, not out of anger, but out of a genuine desire for understanding, had been the moment that set everything in motion. He wasn't seeking revenge, he was seeking transformation. Now, in these final meetings with the airport's leadership, Maya could see that Jason felt a deep sense of empowerment. It wasn't just about how he had stood up for himself, but how he had used his position to create a ripple effect that was changing the entire culture. He understood that his actions were not just symbolic, they were contributing to a broader social change. Jason had become a symbol of accountability, but he had also become a part of something much bigger than himself. His fight for equality was no longer about his own dignity, it was about making sure that everyone, regardless of their race, gender, or background, would have the opportunity to stand in spaces like the airport lounge and be treated with respect. As the meeting came to a close, Jason turned to leave, his face calm but resolute. Maya watched him, a deep sense of pride swelling inside her. He had faced this challenge not only with strength, but with grace. He had turned an unjust situation into a movement, and in doing so, he had inspired change, not just in policy, but in the hearts and minds of those around him. Jason's experience had taught him valuable lessons about the cost of standing up for what's right. He had learned that justice wasn't always going to be easy, and sometimes it would make you uncomfortable. But if you didn't take the steps, if you didn't speak up, the status quo would remain. And while the airport had made strides in implementing the changes he had fought for, Maya knew this fight wasn't over. It wasn't over for the airport, and it certainly wasn't over for the rest of the world. Jason's story had proven one undeniable truth. Change starts with individuals who refuse to remain silent. His actions had sparked a movement, but movements needed more than just one person. They needed a collective of voices willing to stand firm against injustice, no matter how uncomfortable the journey might be. As Maya reflected on everything Jason had accomplished, she posed a question to herself, and to anyone who would listen. How far are we willing to go to ensure that true equality is achieved? What are we willing to sacrifice? The road ahead was still long, and the struggle for justice was far from over. But Jason had set a powerful example. Now, it was up to the rest of them to carry the torch forward. What would they do when the next injustice reared its ugly head? Would they stay silent, or would they rise, as Jason had? As Maya reflected on Jason's journey, she couldn't help but think of the lasting impact his actions had made, not just on the airport, but on herself. It wasn't just the policy changes or the training sessions that stood out to her, but the way Jason had inspired a deeper conversation about racial equality and fairness in places she hadn't expected. Jason had shown her, and so many others, that standing up for what's right doesn't always mean taking dramatic actions or making grand speeches. Sometimes it's about showing up, speaking your truth, and demanding justice, even when it feels uncomfortable. He had faced an overwhelming injustice with quiet strength, challenging the biases that had gone unaddressed for so long. The simple act of saying, "This isn't right," had ignited a spark that was now spreading far beyond the airport's walls. Maya knew that Jason's experience, though deeply personal, was not unique. Every day, people faced the kinds of subtle and overt prejudices that Jason had endured. What made his story different was the way he refused to let it slide. How he turned his anger and frustration into a call for systemic change. He had shown that one person, one story, could make a difference. It had made Maya question her own role in the ongoing fight for racial equality. Before Jason's confrontation, she had been a passive observer, aware of racism, but never quite confronting it head-on. Like many, she had been uncomfortable with the topic, unsure of how to navigate the complexities of race and privilege. But watching Jason take his stand had opened her eyes to the truth. Change didn't happen when people stayed silent. It happened when they acknowledged the issues, took action, and committed to making things better. As conversations around the airport community continued, Maya noticed how Jason's story had sparked more than just policy changes. It had sparked real discussions. The staff, once hesitant to speak about race or prejudice, were now engaging with each other about their own experiences and biases. She overheard more open conversations in the halls, conversations that weren't about blame, but about understanding. Employees from all backgrounds began to share how they had experienced racism, not just in their personal lives, but within the workplace. Maya had never seen this kind of openness before. It was as if a door had been opened, and once the conversation began, it became easier for everyone to continue speaking up. People were beginning to recognize that the fight for racial equality wasn't just a personal struggle for those who were directly affected by prejudice. It was a communal fight, one that required everyone to participate. The momentum from Jason's experience had grown, and now it was clear that the airport's commitment to change was more than just an effort to correct a single wrong. It was a shift in perspective, a commitment to ensuring that everyone felt valued and respected. Jason's experience had transformed not just a policy but a culture, one that was beginning to understand that racism was not an isolated issue. It was an issue that permeated every part of society. Yet Maya knew that even with all the progress, the fight for racial equality was far from over. The changes made at the airport were important, but they were just the beginning. It was easy to feel a sense of accomplishment when change seemed tangible, when training programs were implemented, and when employees began to engage with one another more openly. But Maya understood that the real work was in ensuring that the conversations didn't stop, that the commitment to change remained. It was easy to forget, to slip back into old habits, to think that the battle was won simply because the first steps had been taken. Maya thought of all the conversations she had witnessed, how people were talking about racial equality, how they were examining their own biases, but she also knew how fragile this progress could be. It would take time, sustained effort, and most importantly, the courage to keep pushing forward when complacency set in. Jason had set an example for everyone. He had shown what it looked like to demand fairness and justice, even when it wasn't comfortable. His courage had ignited change, but it would take the continued efforts of everyone in the community to ensure that it wasn't just a momentary shift. The real challenge would be keeping the momentum going, continuing the hard conversations, and staying committed to the cause. Maya couldn't help but wonder how many other workplaces, how many other communities were just like the airport had been before Jason's experience, silent, uncomfortable, and passive. How many people were still afraid to speak out against the injustices they witnessed, too afraid of the repercussions or the discomfort it might cause? She turned the question inward, reflecting on her own role in the ongoing fight for equality. She realized that, like Jason, she couldn't afford to stay silent anymore. It wasn't enough to simply be aware of the issues. It was about speaking up, even when it felt uncomfortable. Maya realized that if she wanted to be part of the change, she had to be willing to engage in the hard conversations, even when they were difficult. And so, Maya asked herself, and now she asks you, the viewer, what role will you play in this fight for justice? How will you contribute to the change in your community, your workplace, or your own life? The struggle for equality is far from over, and it's up to each of us to decide how we will answer that call. What will you do? As Maya stood in the quiet of the airport terminal, reflecting on everything that had transpired, a profound realization settled in her heart. Jason's courage, his fight for justice, had ignited a ripple that had started changing not just the policies at the airport, but the very way people saw each other. It wasn't just about what Jason did for himself, it was about what he did for everyone who had ever been treated as less than, dismissed because of the color of their skin, or pushed aside because of the biases others had chosen to carry with them. But as Maya looked around, she understood that the fight wasn't over. It wasn't enough for things to change at the airport. This needed to spread beyond these walls. Every workplace, every community, every individual had a responsibility to stand up against injustice, even when it was uncomfortable. Every voice mattered. Jason had shown that. He didn't stay silent. And because of that, he had inspired an entire community to take action. He had made people question their own biases, their own assumptions, and now it was time for each of us to do the same. Maya's voice grew softer, her words carrying the weight of everything she had witnessed. Standing up for yourself and for others when faced with injustice is never easy. It takes courage, it takes strength, and sometimes it even takes a bit of discomfort. But if we want to see real change, we have to step out of our comfort zones. We have to have those difficult conversations. We have to confront our biases, and we have to make sure we're part of the solution, not just bystanders to the problem. She paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment before continuing. Each of us has the power to make a difference, whether it's through speaking out when we see something wrong, educating ourselves and others, or supporting policies that promote fairness and equality. The truth is, change begins with us. It starts with the decision to not ignore injustice, but to stand up to it. Maya's eyes seemed to look directly into the camera, as if speaking to each viewer personally. So what will you do? Will you stay silent, or will you rise, just like Jason did? Will you let the opportunity to make a real difference slip by, or will you choose to be part of something bigger than yourself? She took a breath and let it out slowly. The work isn't over. We still have a long way to go, and every step we take together matters. If you've been moved by this story, if it sparked something within you, then take that first step. Start a conversation. Educate yourself. Stand up for justice. Your actions, no matter how small they may seem, will contribute to the change we need. If you've learned something from Jason's story, if you've been inspired to make a difference, don't just sit back. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and comment below with your thoughts. Tell us how you plan to contribute to the fight for racial equality. Together, we can make sure that stories like Jason's don't just end here, but continue to fuel the change we all desperately need. Thank you for watching, and remember, change starts with us. Stand up, speak out, and never stay silent in the face of injustice.